Hello everyone, I am Disha K of CSE Cybersecurity Department. Today I am going to discuss about the testing of hypothesis. Introduction to the testing of hypothesis. Testing of hypothesis is statistically procedure used to make inference about the population based on a sample data. It involves formulating the null and alternative hypothesis, collecting and analyzing the data, and make a decision about the hypothesis. The goal is determine if there is enough evidence to support or reject the null hypothesis. Null and alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis represents the status no effect, while the alternative hypothesis represents a new effect. The null hypothesis assumes that any observed difference or effect due to a random chance, simplifying a variability. The alternative hypothesis suggests that there is a real effect or a difference in a population. Type 1 and Type 2 errors. Type 1 errors occurs when we reject the null hypothesis. When it is actually true, this is known as a false positive. Type 2 errors occurs when we fail to reject the null hypothesis. When it is actually false, this is known as a false negative. The significance level is the probability of the making a type 1 error, while the power of the test 1 minus beta is the probability of the correctly rejecting a false of a null hypothesis of a type 1 and type 2 errors. Test statistics and p-value. Test statistics are calculated to measure the strength of the evidence against the null hypothesis. The p-value is probability of the obtaining the test statistic as extreme or more extreme than the observed value, assuming the null hypothesis is true. If the value is less than the significance value, we reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Independent samples t-test. An independent samples t-test is used to compare the means of two independent groups. The null hypothesis assumes that the means of two groups are equal. The alternative hypothesis suggests that the means of two groups are significantly different. Paired samples t-test. A paired samples t-test is used to compare the means of two related or paired samples. The null hypothesis assumes that the mean difference between the paired samples is zero. The alternative hypothesis suggested that the mean difference is significantly different from a zero. Chi-square test of independence. The chi-square test of independence is used to determine if there is a relationship between the two category variables. The null hypothesis assumes that there is no association between the variables. The alternative hypothesis suggested that there is a significant association between the variables. Analysis of a variance. Analysis of a variance is used to compare the means of a three or more group simultaneously. The null hypothesis assumed that the all group means are equal. The alternative hypothesis suggested that the least one group mean is significantly different from the others in an analysis of a variance. Assumptions of the hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing assumes that the data follows a normal distribution. Assumptions of the hypothesis testing follows a level of the measurement of the variable, the method of a sampling, the shape of the population distribution, and the sample space. It assumes that the observation are independent of each other. It assumes that a sample representative of the population. Sample size and power. Sample size play a crucial role in hypothesis testing. A large sample size increases the power of the test, making it more likely to detect a true effect. The power of the study increases with the increases in a sample test. Minimum power of the study required to 80%. Power analysis can be used to determine the required sample size to achieve the desired level of the power. Confidence intervals. Confidence intervals provide a range of the values within which a true population parameter is likely to fall. They are often used in a conjunction within hypothesis testing to provide a more understanding of the data. If null value falls within a confidence intervals, we fail to reject the null hypothesis in a confidence intervals. Common mistakes in hypothesis testing. Failing to clear the specific the null and alternative hypothesis using in approximate statistical test for the research question. A type 1 error occurs in null hypothesis that is actually true in a population. Type 2 error occurs in a null hypothesis. It is actually false in a population. The p-value probability of the null hypothesis being is true in a common mistakes of hypothesis testing. Steps in hypothesis testing. Formulate the null and alternative hypothesis. Choose an approximate statistical test. Collect and analyze the data. Examples of hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing, whether a new drug is more efficient than a placebo. Hypothesis testing, whether there is a difference mean salary between the two industries. Hypothesis testing, whether a new teaching method improves the student performance. Limitations of hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing cannot be prove causation, only provide evidence for against the hypothesis. It is a sensitive to sample size and assumption. It does not count for all possible factors that may influence the result in a hypothesis testing. Conclusion of a testing of hypothesis. Testing of hypothesis is a fundamental tool in a statistical analysis. It allows to make the informed decision based on a data and evidence. Understanding the principles of technique use hypothesis testing is essential for conducting the research.